without any further ado, please welcome to the stage Sage Breslin. Come on up here.
Oh, bad boy, a boy, toy.
Give Sage a big round of applause. Let's go.
You know, I was thinking about what Ed said about listening to Lose Yourself. And so when I was back with the guys, they actually had it queued up, and I was listening to it, and I was like, yeah. And I was going to come out and say, all right, ladies, how many of you want to be boss senoritas? Anybody? No? Not anybody? Woo, right? Okay, but I want to be also mindful of the fact that we have quite a few men here. So how many of you want to be bosses of your life? Not necessarily the boss, but bosses of your life, right? Okay, so how many of you, by a raise of hands, have a sense that you're doing pretty well, but you feel like there's more? Okay, so pretty good amount. And how many of you feel like lurking below the surface, there may be some limits? You may actually kind of recognize what those obstacles are. Okay, a few of you, all right. And how many of you who notice that feel like you're ready right now to deep dive into that and actually experience what those obstacles have you feel like? A couple, right? And how many of you would consider yourselves experts in not only identifying what those blocks and limits, whether they're in circumstances, ideas, beliefs, relationships, dynamics, or personal history? How many of you feel like you could accurately identify what those limits are or obstacles are and resolve them? Okay, a couple of you. Probably, you maybe even do it for a living.
With your help, we could.
Well, by the time you leave here, you will at least have just some foundational building blocks for what that's like to break through and pass those limits. So in January of 1982, it was kind of an awful night. And on that night, after being held in a local cartel for more than a year, I was sold for $500 and a gram of cocaine. So the buyer, kind of evil guy that he was, poured liquor down my throat until I stopped struggling, and then raped me savagely. And when I came to, I was in front of my house. I was disheveled, but I was in front of my house. And for the life of me, I could not think of a single reason why I would continue living. I couldn't think of a single reason. I thought, you know, what would be a lot easier is if I could just stop this agony, if this could just be over. And I walked into my house, and I took a bottle of pills, and I laid down on the floor of my room, and I waited to die. Yeah, so for 30 years, this is my next memory. My memory is that I jumped up moments later, and I ran to the bathroom, and I puked my guts out. And then I climbed into my Ford Mustang, and I drove to this local cathedral where my mom liked to worship, and I banged on the sanctuary until the minister opened the door. And the minister let me in, and, you know, we sat in the pews together, and all night we talked about how incredibly lost I felt, how disconnected, how disenfranchised, how ashamed I felt of the choices I had made and the choices that had been made for me. And, you know, as the sun came up, he leaned in and he said, you know what? You've never been disconnected from God. God doesn't do that. You gotta be kidding me. You're okay. You're here for a purpose. You just need to realize that. And I got back into my Mustang and I drove home and I laid down and I went to sleep. Except that's not what happened. What happened is I laid down on the floor, and I died. And while I was clinically dead, I floated through the tween space because I could not actually have driven my Mustang anywhere with that load of medication on board. And I floated to a place that held only positive memories for me, a place where I'd been by my mom's side since I was little, and where I felt at home, where I felt at peace. And I had a conversation with my version of God. Yeah, in his own image. Yeah, okay. So my version of God was this minister. And for what felt to me like hours and hours and hours, I was able to finally resolve that disconnect that I'd been feeling, that disenfranchisement that I'd been feeling. And I was able to feel God's embrace around me. I was able to really know in my heart, I can do this. I can live through this. And like that, I was yanked back into my body, bolt upright, turned around, puked my guts out, and only then did I lay down on my bed and pass out. So I wish my story had started there. I wish my story had ended there, frankly. That would have been at least very simple. But the fact is, I was born kind of different, and I always knew I was different. I knew I wasn't like the other little girls. I didn't do the same kinds of stuff they did. I was more clairvoyant, so I poked a lot of people because I couldn't tell the difference between who had a body and who didn't. And that's unusual. It's kind of woo-woo. Just how I grew up. And unfortunately, it meant I was isolated. And because I was isolated, I was easy to spot by perpetrators. And so that night in January of 1982, it wasn't the worst night. It wasn't the worst day. But it was the day in which I knew without a doubt that I would no longer be harmed or exploited or abused and feel helpless and hopeless. So as I said, I kind of wish the story had stopped there. Unfortunately, days later, I lost my daughter, Emily. It was a pregnancy I was carrying. And while a lot of people would feel horrified and feel like, oh my God, raped in a cartel, ooh. She felt like the one good thing that I had that was mine, that belonged to me. But when I lost her, I recognized, I don't think I could have done this until I had that conversation with God. I recognized that she was tied to the cartel. And by letting her go, I was able to just flee. And flee I did. I fled to freedom and resources. I made it to college, and unfortunately in college, I had a very terrible car accident, I had a brain injury, and I lost my ability to think the way other people thought. My dream of medical school went bye-bye, and I felt devastated. I had to learn to talk again, to think again, and I had to kind of remap my life. But 18 months later, I made it to graduate school, and I tried to embrace it. I did pretty well with it until I had a terrible injury and was paralyzed. So there I am, flat. Had been an aerobics instructor. It was how I was making my way through school, and that went away. About 15 years later, flash forward, I am giving birth to twins. It's emergent. It's at 30 weeks. Out I go. Out one twin goes. All I can say is thank God for medical science. 4 years later, I'm trying to finally get my female form redone after all of that emergency. And 3 times more, I flatline. So that's a lot of trauma. That's a lot of tragedy for one person. But what I came to understand is that my life wasn't just about trauma. It was about transformation and triumph over the trauma. Amen. Absolutely. And so from there, I've got to tell you, each of those instances, I let go of my daughter so I could go forward to freedom. I go to the next time, okay, not medical school, you know what? I did damn well as a graduate student. I love the job I have now. And from there, moving forward, I fought for my children and myself to survive. And when I was there, flatlining 3 times with a medical team who didn't happen to notice I was wearing a red bracelet that said, no opiates, it was my voice, finally, that said, no more, no opiates, just like that. And they stopped and said, oh my God, what have we done? So I learned something during this journey. I learned that it's connection that empowers transformation. Connection to self, connection to something greater than the self, and connection to others. Something even more important in my work as a life coach and breakthrough specialist is that breakthrough requires reconnection of all those parts of yourself, of all those versions of yourself that have been left behind, that have been cast off, that have been buried. Guess what? You want to break through those limits that you have? You want to break through your history? You want to 10x, hey, 20x, 100x your business? If there's something below the surface that is powering that, fueling that, you got to break through. What does that mean? You've got to be able to plug in those parts. I had to learn that I had to take all of that stuff that I'd cast off, and I had to learn how to love it and embrace it and honor it and forgive it and be all of me. The first building block is connection. Connection to yourself, connection to something greater than yourself. For me, that's God, or whatever that means, G-O-D, you fill in the blanks, and connection to others. And I've got to tell you the last bit, that was hard for me. Connection with God, always good with that. The connection to myself is what saved me. It's what got me up off the canvas, time after time after time. But the connection to others was hard because connecting with others meant for me, hey, you're going to get hurt, you're going to get exploited or abused. So along the way, I met Ed, and about 2 years ago when we started talking, I noticed something. First of all, I noticed that I didn't feel afraid with him. And I think when he came out as a praying man, during one of the speeches, I was like, I'm going to get with that guy. I want to know more about that. Because I was doing it behind closed doors, right? But I wasn't actively incorporating it into my business. Now, I recognize who I am. I am fully me. If you meet me in the grocery store or in the office or outside walking or by the beach, I am what I am. I showed up, boss senorita. By the way, I do have the corporate dress. It's blue. It's in my bag. I have heels. But boss senorita needed to show up today to say, y'all going to be exactly who you're meant to be. I am exactly who I'm meant to be, and I was seen by Ed Rush in my entirety. For that, I owe him such incredible gratitude. And if you have an opportunity to work with him, do it. I don't care what the investment is, do it. It will change your life. It changed my life. So as a way to honor that, if any of you want to know a little bit more about more of the building blocks, I have a book on the market. I'm happy to send you a free copy. Just see me sometime before we all leave. Thank you so much for hearing me. Thank you.
She got that old time swagger with that new school touch. It's
Senorita!
She don't want no bad boy or boy.